Zagreb and Croatia, who made it possible for us to have our symposium on their premises. The building where our office is located and the hall where we held similar gatherings were badly damaged by the earthquake in March 2020. So we can't stay or work there like here. The Society of Art Historians has organized scientific conferences dedicated to our senior fellow art historians, and we have published presentations from these conferences in special publications. Now, the topic is Ljubo Karaman, who is one of the pioneers of our profession, art history and protection of cultural monuments. He studied in Vienna at a time when the so-called Vienna School of Art History was at its peak and received his doctorate in 1920 from professors Max Dvorak and Josef Styczykowski. What he learned during his studies, he very successfully applied in practice in Croatia, especially in Dalmatia, where he joined the great archaeologist and conservator Frano Gulić. In 1926, Karaman took over the conservation service there, and from 1941 to 1950, he headed the conservation service in Zagreb. We owe him a lot, whether it is his theoretical work that he articulated very early and created adequate tools to better understand and interpret cultural heritage, and not only Croatian, or his rich practice in the field of monument protection. His most important contribution to the general history of art lies in his theoretical considerations of the notions of the periphery, the true historical basis of which is the artistic heritage of the Croatian regions. This conference, the conference in Zagreb, will contribute to a critical reflection of the origins and the challenges of the dualistic paradigm, primarily in art history between the Adriatic coast and Central Europe, which was the focus of Karaman's work. I am glad that after various difficulties, primarily related to COVID-19, but also to the consequences of the earthquake that hit our society hard, we were finally able to meet today and here and start this conference. Today, all these problems are behind us, and therefore I believe that it is a good time to start working, because there is a lot of discussion and they are very diverse, but the success will certainly be very good. So, once again, I greet everyone and wish a pleasant and successful work to all participants and moderators. So, I invite Professor Jasenka Gudelj to moderate this session. Jasenka.
Thank you, Professor Maković, our dear president of the Society of Croatian Art Historians. I'm sorry, I always make mistakes with the exact translation of the title in English, but I made it. Hopefully I did it right. It is my great pleasure to be the first moderator this morning at this extremely important conference for Zagreb art history, but also, as we can see, for my extremely rich and international program, the theme has been dear and near to the research interest of many researchers across Europe and all the way to Canada. I would like to ask our first presenter today, Magdalena Kunińska of Jagiellonian University in Krakow, to come up and prepare for her presentation. She's assistant professor at one hour of the most ancient art history departments in Europe as well. We were shared with our art history in Zagreb more or less the year of foundation. So this is a great pleasure to start with Professor Kunińska, please. And I would also ask everybody to take the exact amount of time they're assigned. Thank you. Oh, I'm bad at this.
You can just,
I will turn off
the microphone. Okay, so I will try to do my best. It's a great honor for me, and I have to explain my second affiliation. It used to be also New York College where I was a senior researcher in art historiography in Central and Eastern Europe project and inquiry from the perspective on Entangled histories. And it was ERC grant terminated in a very tragic for us situation because of that of Haidu, our friend and PI. So that's the story, and I will try to speak today about Entangled case of style problem in Central and Eastern Europe between central model and local strategies for self-identification. Sorry, I have some problems with my voice because of AC in the plane. So there is a huge theoretical problem, and there is a book. It's going to be in a few days published by Routledge. It's an outcome of our project, and for sure, art historical narratives understood widely as programs for training, displaying national art, creating a canon of monuments to preserve and research and on and etc. Use a tool for building a nation are understood in terms of Benedict Anderson imagined communities, and it remained at the very center of the research on historiography for over 20 years, also in Eastern Europe, as Jan Bakoš stated, are slowly giving away to other issues, while the quotation, the zenith of research into the relationship between epistemology and ideology is almost over. We all recognize the situation described among others by the Meyer, that modern art history and nationalism grew up hand in hand. And there is an issue of Umani published last year, where the question of theoretical framework for researching of art history in Eastern Central Europe was posed by Matthew Rampley in a very provocative way. This article titled Network Horizons, Centers and Hierarchies on the Challenges of Writing on Modernism in Central Europe. There might be points to the difficulties in applying Piotrowski's model presented in 2008 in the text on the special third on horizontal art history. For Rampley, simply inverting the center-periphery relation and looking for cracks in the central nucleus. Rampley also considered the use of the entangled histories, and from my experience, it's also really difficult to apply entangled art history proposed by Bana and Zimmerman as problematic due to the barriers related inter alia to the complex linguistic structure of the region, but also networks promoted by Vladimir, pointing to a number of difficulties related to crossing the center-periphery model. However, Rampley considers it most important to avoid the situation of quotation parallel individual research conducted from the point of view of individual countries and nations. The scope of the response to Rampley's text was enormous. The author's closest me to the answer of Milena Bartnova from Czech Academy of Science, who points out that in the case of the countries of the region, avoiding the national context would be losing sight of an important research factor, And she proposed an application of Bruno Latour's actor method theory for the research on art historiography in our region. Starting from the problem, I will speak in the name of our whole team, and from the project, when we started, we wanted to address three terms: periodization, style, and influence, and we managed to do only with periodization, but it appeared that at some point, because of use of style, as Zawalander, for example, defined it, once the modern concept of style had been linked with originality, style developed into an instrument of a more subtle and more flexible, which allowed a sensitive response to an overgrowing number of particular originalities. It's the great achievement of art history around 1900 that it brought this evolution to its climax. But let us once more recall there is one fatal turning point in this long process. The moment when, in the age of the Enlightenment, style was linked with the idea of periodization, evolution, progress. Needless to repeat, it was only then that the notion of style was changed from an instrument for art appreciation of better art theory into a tool for art history. And we grouped all these terms as entangled between each other because the issue seemed to be interrelated, and we should consider them accordingly. Style, as we tried to research on, was understood as construct in terms of James Ackerman theory of style, as the generalization which we form by comparing individual works into shapes that are convenient historical and critical purposes, or for history to be written at all, we must find in what we study factors which at once are consistent enough to be distinguishable and changeable, enough to have a story. But also, as my mentor and friend Wojciech Bałus wrote a few years ago, the concept of style becomes a shield, a veil that allows us to look at an architectural, not only phenomenon, and make it something known and vague. And for me, also the style has its performative function. And during our work in the project, we tried to research on dynamic relation between the general model or models and particular features of national styles. And there are some outcomes. For sure, we have split between ideal Byzantine shrine, where what is the model for places like Romania, but not only, but also site of Parkovanaska in Romania, or vernacular organs of Balkan Byzantine style, or 17th century revival in Russia, or another point of reference for identifying national styles, like in the case of Poland, was of course national versions of Western models or also vernacular origins. And for this, we proposed, and I proposed, the adaptation of peripheries and their creativity proposed by Lucina Marat after Patrick Geary and Walter Mignolo, who wrote about colonies, but it's fully applicable here, and looking toward a non-hierarchical model, and also so criticized by Matthew Hamley, but I think it's only possible the theory of Piotr Piotrowski, so seeing the center from the outside the center for framing the region. And some examples of this identification from our authors and also my colleagues. For example, as Cosmin Linea wrote, Metropolitan Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, Sibiu, inaugurated in 1960, 6 was attempt to make monuments fit within ideal erasing their peculiarities, and Timo Hagen also stated that it was truly Orthodox and truly Romanian style, as we could see. And of course, there's a extremely complicated regional situation in this place. The second example is Church, Cathedral Church, which was researched by Cosmin restoration around 1880. And it was chosen because of its typical for Romania stylistic features, or because at the same time the situation in Europe was similar. The Museum of National Revival, described by Ada Hajdu and then edited by Anna Daszyńska, it was a kind of attempt to build the Bulgarian people in honor of the struggle for church independence and political independence. The building of the museum has to be in the Bulgarian Byzantine style. Of course, possible sources of inspiration was medieval and Ottoman buildings on the territory of Bulgaria and Macedonia, and it was published in 1901. There are some projects in the competition. Some conclusions of our literature are like this. Starting from the project, the research was going to show that the three concepts that we choose to focus on, periodization, style, and influence, are far from neutral or strictly descriptive, and their use in art history needs to be reconciled, and we try to do it. And it was a process in a constant movement. On the one hand, positioning on the map of Eastern Byzantine, and on the other hand, on Western tradition. And it was a mechanism of rationalization of the past in terms of style. There's my rather question if we can apply a fascinating concept of methodological imperialism in art history formulated in 2012 versus another uses of style for national identification was also a cause colonization by architecture, like in the case of Alexander Nevsky Church in Warsaw, built during the partition by Russian government and created by Laurent Benoit, or even in art historiography, when in Kronkinsberg, the church of St. Panteleimon in Szewczenkowo, near Halić, was the border reputation of Western civilization, was used with the full consequences of these words. And in case of Poland, because for sure it's for me the most interesting, we had three approaches to the styles. First voices we had about 1860. There was some critical opinions of Joseph Kramer, philosopher and aesthetician. There were, after that, were efforts to specify one particular style. I will show some examples. And since 19 homely, vernacular, or heimat is also my question, modernism in architecture, and three approaches to style, highly abstractive, notion of term inherited from Hegelian historiography, brought via Schnase and Kugler's Handbücher, and sustaining the metaphysical notion of architecture as the highest achievement of the human spirit. And because of that, postulating his position as the first choice for research, then another approach is descriptive one, and scientific, postulating and empirical investigating of architectural forms. And it was, for example, Władysław Łuszkiewicz studies in Romanesque architecture, My colleague is writing her thesis on it. And finally, a prescriptive one when dealing with the present purposes, but defining the national style and postulating aesthetic choices. And some examples for strategies. For example, to international Warsaw Cathedral proposed by Adam Iskowski, which was a counter mechanism of self-identification and bordering civilization, and it was highly criticized by contemporaries. And solutions, romantic historicism, vernacular modes, inventing the national soul, early modernism, primeval shape of style forms, and male style. Some another examples, digital Baltic style as a counterpart for the style of the Orthodox Church. For example, counter this by Benoit. It was constructed competition in 1886. That there was a tenet that the church should be built in the pointed arch style. Another pattern for all churches in Poland should be St. Church in Krakow, and Karaman wrote that St. Church is in its body and so the representative of our Gothic churches. That's why, for example, in Budowo, Stefan Schiller built a church with asymmetric towers. It was a rather far reference to the St. Mary Church in Krakow. Another chose Krakow system and its specific shapes and modes of constructions, where we have buttresses inside the building across the pillars and connected with some elements. And it was also a kind of searching for national identification by new revival styles, but also, for example, there's a concept as a nuance of the variant of Renaissance and Poland. And we can really expand this set of examples like this. But to the conclusion, and I think that I fix to the time, we have to look on the turn of style in Eastern Central Europe from, I think, from two perspectives. The first one, writing theory and history of style in East Central Europe is possible with recognizing common places and strategies which are really similar in all countries of the region, but we should also identify local choices that were important for the building of national identity. And for sure, we cannot bypass on this level the national perspective, as was proposed by Bradley, but as Milena Barkova stated, it would be really destructive for the history of art history and the history of architecture and so on in our central region. To the patron of today's conference, there is another way of research in Polish styles proposed by Andrzej Szczerski, and Andrzej Szczerski is directly referencing to Ljubo Karaman and his centre-periphery theory. For me, a little bit too essentialistic, but still, it's still alive. Thank you.
To make work the other microphone, but Thank you, Magdalena Kunińska, for this extremely rich presentation of the results of incredibly unfortunate and fortunate project. Fortunate because ERC recognized the importance of the theme that was explored through the theme of entangled art history in Eastern Europe. But on the other hand, we all know what happened in the club, and the project came to an earlier close. There are several ERC projects that are in course, and we hope that the results of the others will entangle with the results of this temporary results of the Romanian project, and we'll have a really rich exploration of these concepts. I would like to ask Alison McQueen from Master Linguist in Canada to take the floor. And now we're moving from Eastern European to the French context, as Professor McQueen has explored so widely French context of the 19th century. But here she will be speaking about entangled interdependence, French provinces and colonies in the mid-19th century. Professor McQueen, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I thank Martina and Jasenka and Franco and Predrag and the colleagues for organizing our conference. I apologize that I'm presenting today in my travel clothes. I was very glad to arrive safely from Canada yesterday, but my luggage did not. So if you see me wearing this tomorrow, then you will know that it still has not arrived. I'm grateful for this opportunity to discuss my book project, tentatively entitled Paris Global Arts Capital, 1848 to 1870. I am examining the periods of the Second Republic and the Second Empire, and I offer you the dates for those, under the same ruler, elected president, and then self-declared emperor. A period during which I argued the combined forces of political will, economic prosperity, and deeply rooted beliefs in the value of art and architecture supported events that shaped both the face of Paris as we know it today and its significance as one of the global capitals of the arts in the mid-19th century. My interest in our focus on centre-periphery studies is that I'm reflecting on how my work perpetuates a well-entrenched perspective that Paris equals innovation in a French context and in a Western European, and they would like to think global context, specifically in the context of the history of art and culture. The government structure in France during the reign of Louis Napoleon, who became Emperor Napoleon III, centralized power in the capital of Paris, reinforcing the structure developed, I would say, by the railway system in France beginning much earlier in the century. What I would like to discuss is some of the ways in which I'm exploring the Paris-based government's relationship with its peripheries, both the provinces within metropolitan France and also overseas colonies. I'm thinking about how the government exerts imperial authority through the arts and how the status of Paris as a capital is entangled and interdependent upon human and material resources of France's provinces and colonies. My research prior to this book focused on Empress Eugénie and her patronage of art and architecture. From that, I have been able to explore the ways in which their imagery takes imperial authority from the capital. Copies of these paintings were placed in many places within metropolitan France. And more recently, I have discovered how they were also taken globally, not only to places that France had under colonial power, but also locations such as today's Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, where France was, through asymmetrical trade agreements, enacting its imperial authority in Southeast Asia. So their portraits are there to symbolize that. You may notice the difference here. So that's the original set of pendant portraits that express this imperial power in colonial and other locations. Then I'm showing you the changed set, a later portrait of Napoleon III, placed always with the younger portrait of Eugénie. That, and then I'm showing you copies of these were sent to various colonial posts, again, to symbolize imperial power. So there is, through the representation and expression of that imperial power in the French colonies, that's not previously been discussed. That has also been expressed through a sculpture of Empress Josephine, who was the first wife of Napoleon I, the uncle of Napoleon III, and copies of this sculpture were sent to France's colonial outpost in Martinique. Do you wish to read that?
We do apologize. I'm not really sort of interruption, but
I can try to project, but it does not help with the recording. I don't know where the microphone cut off. Probably here. So I was looking at the ways in which the copies of the portraits of this later set went to various French colonies to represent imperial power. And then also how the government commissioned a sculpture of Empress Josephine, the first wife of Napoleon I, the step-grandfather and uncle of Napoleon III, and how that went to Martinique, again a French colony, a way of symbolizing her place of origin and French imperial power. So what are the other ways in which we can see connections between the centralized government in Paris and its connections with the provinces of France? One of the ways that I'm interested in is how the centralized government supported developments in photography, including the Heliographic Society that began in 1851. And the French government paid for photographers to go around metropolitan France, so within the provinces, and to record historic monuments, some of which survive in negative, some in positive, and how those were records of the country's cultural heritage, valued by the center, expressing the periphery within metropolitan France, and how that intersected with some of the protection of cultural heritage or reconstruction in what is today really a fantasy kind of Disney World reconstruction of Carcassonne, a medieval city in southern France. I'm also considering how the popularity of paintings meant that the government paid attention to more peripheral locations, such as Fontainebleau, southeast of Paris, and the environmental area of the forest of Fontainebleau. So this relates to an interest in painting nature outside of Paris, which was very popular with collectors in the capital. And I'm particularly interested in this individual, Rousseau, who, along with Gustave Le Gray, the photographer, presented the idea to Napoleon III to protect the forest of Fontainebleau. And so it became the first international government-protected environmental area in a context of ecological perspective that we see there. So there's a connection between the collecting of paintings and the protection of this landscape zone outside the capital. The primary focus of what I want to discuss with you, though, is how the capital used technological and particularly material resources, through extracting natural resources from the earth within metropolitan France and its colonies in order to build the capital and express its power. So this is a result we will be discussing on Saturday, population growth. I give you the statistics on the population growth of Paris on the left, largely a result of in-migration, so movement of people within France, doubling the population in the first half of the 19th century, and then in the period I work on, nearly doubling again. So approximately 1/3 of Paris was rebuilt in this period. And I'm interested in both how that happened and the materials used to make it happen. So for example, the very famous Place Saint-Michel, I'm interested in where the materials come from, particularly colored stones, including materials from provincial metropolitan France, such as the Jura. I thought I had it outlined here. And also the Languedoc region in provincial France. So this is an instances where materials are being, stones are being extracted from the earth in order to create the capital, and how today, when we look at these public sculptures, there's no information about that resource extraction available to us. So it reads as something that represents the country, and yet we don't realize the ways in which the peripheries are manifest through materials. So the Languedoc region, and the Jura come for these polychrome columns and frieze. That got me thinking about the very famous opera built in the Second Empire in Paris, and particularly the interior staircase, very famous, and it's polychrome. And I started to wonder where those materials came from. And I'm very happy to have recently found a detailed study in the context of the Universal Exposition held in Paris in 1867. That details all of the materials used to make this famous space and exactly where, so all the provincial regions in France, I had wondered where they came from. So that's again an example of materials from the provinces used to create the center. There are also all kinds of examples of those same materials being used for mantelpieces and other items in individuals' homes. So public and private spaces. From there, the government also got involved in extracting natural resources from its colonies, most notably Algeria. And the sculptor Cordier was sent on a government-funded trip to North Africa, to Tunisia and Algeria, and through government-open quarries, had access to polychrome materials, particularly Algerian onyx marble, which were then sent through sculptures to Paris and sold at what I would estimate are under market value prices for the cost of the materials, which suggests a suppressed labor market in the peripheral location of colonial Algeria. I have also worked on how those materials are used to express power in Algeria, including this statue of a really horrible Governor General who killed many indigenous people in Algeria, and this statue that was erected to him. And here I'm particularly interested in the Algerian stone used to create the pedestal. And I've located the quarry and information on this infrastructure the government created in order to open a quarry here that had never before been opened to extract material to create this pedestal, which cost 3 times as much as the bronze here. The pedestal does not survive anymore. In 1962, when this statue was taken from Algeria when it achieved independence, the pedestal was left behind. So there is extraction of materials and natural resources that come to be highly symbolic, both in Paris and in colonial locations, through how this is a mid-19th century image of the statue in Algeria, in Algiers, capital of colonial French Algeria. So I'm interested, bring together the various images. I'm interested in the ways in which materials, so rather than a stylistic analysis, the way in which human resources through the people working in the quarries, and also all natural resources of material extraction come to express imperial French power to itself in the capital and in the colonial locations, both in ways that are very transparent and also ways in which those histories are masked, particularly in how we come to see these kinds of public spaces, and we forget really the ways in which they express imperial power without the peripheries that not being at all possible to articulate. Thank you very much.
This was fantastic insight into the place we all consider a center of European art history, but how it looked into, on a material level, its colonies in the political context. So my greatest pleasure is also to invite our next speakers, who are Ines, Ivić, and Cristiano Guarneri from Catholic University in Venice, who are also involved in the PRC Algarve project that I'm directing. Their paper, done in 2 hats or 2 voices, will speak about different perspectives on centre-periphery paradigm, Karaman and Castelnuovo-Ginzburg in comparison. Please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jasenka, for the introduction.
Please.
Since we planned this in 15 minutes and in order not to waste time, we will proceed with the presentation, where I will read the first part and then Cristiano will take over for the second one. The centre-periphery paradigm, the core question of here addressed essays, has characterized the scholarship for a long time. This paper presents a comparative reading of 2 seminal works of Croatian and Italian historiography, discussing and describing the relationship between the artistic production in the cultural centers and in the area far from them, traditionally characterized as periphery or province. Ljubo Karaman's essay on the influence of the local environment in the art of Croatian lands, written in 1963 and republished in 2001 under the title Problems of Peripheral Art, and Enrico Castelnuovo and Carlo Ginzburg essay Center and Periphery, originally published in 1979 as a chapter in the Analisi Storia dell'Arte Italiana. Such a choice, however, is not a random one. The centuries-long historical and cultural connections between the 2 coasts of the Adriatic Sea have necessarily influenced the depending but largely different historiographical reflections on the artistic production of both Croatian and Italian scholars. This paper indeed starts from Karaman's observations, but does not have the intention to offer a diverse perspective on the same artistic production. Even more so because Ginzburg and Castelnuovo do not consider the cultural and geographical area of the Eastern Adriatic coast in their essay. Rather, we aim to present the main ideas of these 2 works, which independently identify the same research problems, describe diverse artistic phenomena, and offer the new approach to its historiographical assessment, but without mutually communicating. The first common point between the authors is a general interest in the regions that could be defined as peripheral, both by the geographical location, art historical assessment, and the historiographical treatment. If for Karaman this is manifest, then it is worth to underline that Castelnuovo and Ginzburg's research interests lay within the area across the Alpine arc, from Piedmont over province in Switzerland to Friuli. Nevertheless, their scholarly background and approach differ significantly. To begin with, they belong to different generations, with Karaman being born 40 years before Castelnuovo and even 50 years before Ginzburg. Karaman wrote his essay already as an established scholar, offering in a way a sum of his career, while Castelnuovo and Ginzburg published their essay in the middle of early stage of their careers, as a methodological statement to be applied in the future research. Their institutional and educational background also differs. Karaman got his degree from University of Vienna at the very beginning of the 20th century. Castelnuovo and Ginzburg were educated in northern and central Italian universities. Unlike the Italian duo, which held position of professorships, respectively in medieval art history and modern history in the most important Italian and American universities, such as Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa, Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, Karaman's engagement was more of practical kind. He spent his life working as a conservation officer, first in Dalmatia and then in central Croatia, having the opportunity to observe a number of monuments discussed in his synthesis. These diverse backgrounds reflect on the different approach and the content of both texts. Karaman offers a practical approach, seeking to provide the future art historians with applicable categories for the interpretation and preservation of the artistic and cultural heritage. Even though he does not omit the criticism of the scholarship of his own time, the starting point of his analysis and discourse are the monuments and the artworks. On the contrary, Castelnuovo and Ginzburg hold on to the theoretical approach of the university-level scholarly research, consisting of the criticism of the scholarship and the application of the centre-periphery concept in it. Still, knowing that their essay was published in the first volume of the History of Italian Art, their approach and aim are clear: to dissect the centuries-long art historical scholarship from Vasari and Lanzi onwards, to criticize the present misinterpretation of the art produced in periphery, and to offer methodological tools for a better evaluation of the artistic phenomena outside the main artistic centers, but without offering the applicable categories for such evaluation. The discussed time frame in both essays is quite similar, spanning from the 11th to the 18th centuries, but the focus of both works is mainly on the transitional period between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, seen in the fact that the major part of the mentioned artworks dates to the 14th and the 15th centuries. The question of geographical areas taken into consideration is far more complex. Karaman is mostly preoccupied with the artistic production of the territory of present-day Croatia, which throughout history did not make a compact political and cultural space. Due to its historical geopolitical position between stronger political powers, this area has been often in the position of a liminal territory, and as such could be interpreted as the periphery. He investigates the different impulses arriving to that area, considering not only those traditionally observed, such as the Apennine Peninsula, but also the Ottoman Empire or the Hungarian Kingdom, although without going into the deeper assessment of possible influence. Castelnuovo and Ginzburg limit their analysis to the Apennine Peninsula, with a small look just beyond the Alps on Provence and Switzerland. They are not interested in tracing the contacts and possible influence from or to other areas outside of the peninsula and its islands, but rather to investigate the relationship between artistic centers and periphery within its geographical borders. Paradoxically, Karaman often refers to the Croatian nation mostly as our, which at his time did not correspond to the eponymous political entity, while Castelnuovo and Ginzburg do the opposite, consider the cultural production through the lens of belonging to the Italian nation and political entity, which as such did not exist in the past. The historiography which Karaman opposes is the one that through traditional comparative perspective, mostly based on the evaluation of the quality of the artistic expression, and which labeled the art of the Croatian land as traditional, conservative, primitive, or provincial. Already in the introduction, he explained his standpoint between the foreign and local scholars. The first one saw the influx of the cultural impact to the eastern Adriatic coast and its hinterlands as one-sided, triggered by the forces of the movement, represented by political domination or trading and merchant routes, while the latter ones emphasize the forces of perseverance, the socio-economic factors of geographical location, the climate associated with that location, and the ethnic factor. The concept of periphery could be also applied to Karaman's historiographical position. After the Second World War, the Croatian national art history longed for the emancipation through search of its own national artistic and cultural identity. A picture of the political space he discusses is often a vague one, defined by formulations such as local masters, which local scholars return to our nation. At the same time, he expresses that his approach was intended to contribute to the re-evaluation of local artistic production. The pretensions of the Italian cultural nationalism between two world wars, which he experienced firsthand, certainly has contributed to the articulation of the three categories of provincial, border, and peripheral environment, for which we believe it's not necessary to give further explanations here. The method he proposes was to overcome the complexes of cultural and national inferiority through observing the artistic production in its own organic development, under the influence of cultural centers, but through a different nature and dynamic of adoption, adaptation, and circulation of forms, models, and ideas. On the contrary, Castelnuovo and Ginzburg do not have the tendency to emancipate or promote the Italian art history and artists, as such action was not necessary. So the national patriotic view does not permeate the discussion in a manner Karaman's does. Their criticism of the previous historiography and scholarship aims to show some misinterpretation or simplification of the relationship between center and periphery. They do so through analysis of the quantity of pages and the quality of sources in Lanzi's Storia Pittorica, showing that the discussion of Southern Italian art received only a few pages and was mostly based on the secondary sources. Then they list some commonplaces identifying Vasari's vita, adopted in the later scholarship, such as the talented artist vanished in the province, or the opposite, the provincial artists which flourished after they moved to an artistic center. Besides Italian, they are critical of the international scholarship as well, primarily of Anglo-Saxon for the simplification of the concept, stigmatizing a quotation from Kenneth Clark's book at the very opening of the essay, instead of the simple and plain concept of the diffusion of the artistic models and styles from center to periphery, promoted by such simplistic studies. They opt for the concept of conflict, as developed in the continental Europe, namely in Italian, French, and German scholarship.
Thank you. So, coming to province and periphery, regardless of the common interest in the artistic production of the periphery, the views of the authors on periphery differ. Karaman clearly distinguishes between province and periphery, since the nature of their relation with the center is different and results in different artistic expressions. While the province is defined also in the geopolitical terms, the more decisive factor is the socio-economic context and the financial possibility of the patrons. Without the learned circles which could transmit the motives and forms to ensure their accuracy, the repetitions of motives occur, problems in translation emerge, and followed by the lower quality of artistic expression. Periphery, on the other hand, receives the impulses from different centers and regions, synthesizes them, and results in a certain level of creative freedom, due to the lack of great masters, competitive market, and the authoritative canons of the cultural centers. Castelnuovo and Ginzburg do not differentiate province and periphery as cultural categories. Instead, they see them as synonymous, where periphery is seen as a less compromised word than province, as they clarify at the very beginning of the essay. Periphery or province? Maybe it's better to speak of periphery, a neutral term with no implication regarding an evaluation. These are the very first words of the essay. Through his three categories, Karaman offers a quite applicable theory. For each category, he provides a clear distinction of the formal characteristics of for the classification of the artwork. Even though he warns about the due flexibility in the application of these categories, his scheme is pretty clear, and it reflects upon the structure of the essay. 3 main sections, each one devoted to a single category, with a series of examples showing the characteristics of the different categories. On the contrary, Castelnuovo-Ginzburg strive to render the complexity of a too often simplified phenomenon in the previous scholarship, with no attempt of classification. Besides the analysis of historiography, which take half of the essay, they present a broad and as complete as possible phenomenology of art production in the periphery, taking into account the circulation of artworks, artists, and patrons between centers and peripheries. They focus mainly on the diverse mechanisms and phenomena behind the artworks. So the result is a net of more than 30 different situations, which scheme is simply too complex to be shown in a slide here. It is more interesting for us to focus on their approach to retardation, see as the main phenomenon characterizing the periphery, and classify it into 3 categories of delay: a multi-century, a multi-generational, and a multi-year delay. These categories depend on the ways of production and consumption of the art in the periphery, as well as on the types of the market and the society. So a production addressed only to a self-consumption, like in the peasant or folk art, an oligopoly market often dominated by family workshops repeating the same design through generations, and a competitive free market characterized by creativity and alternative proposals. While Karaman classified the artworks according to their formal features, Castelnuovo-Ginzburg take into account what they consider a more objective factor, time. Here, it is also important to underline other difference between the way the authors perceive the relationship and mutual influence between the artists and the art on one side and the peripheral milieu on the other side. Karaman focuses on the power of peripheral environment and its transformative forces on the artists and the development of the arts, while Castelnuovo-Ginzburg questions the opposite, how the circulation of the different actors influences the formation of center and periphery. Despite these differences, some binding common points emerge. Many phenomena described by both Karaman and Castelnuovo-Ginzburg correspond, together with the noted characteristics of both the peripheral milieu and the artwork produced there. Noticing the delay as one of the main characteristics of the periphery, they question whether it is a result of a pure retardation in a pejorative assertion or a wanted, adequately searched archaism by the artist. They also identified a border milieu or joint areas where a unique and particular mixture of different styles could take place. They advocate the idea of the periphery as the place of the free artistic expression in respect to the imposing canon of the center. So the periphery becomes a milieu welcoming the experimentation according to the artistic canons that were diverging or alternative to those of the center. If the previous scholarship implicitly assumed a linear development of the arts and disregarded everything that deviates from this line of progress, they provided tools, concepts, and methods to investigate, evaluate, and understand the deviation or the displacement. Castelnuovo-Ginzburg illustrates this displacement with the image of a knight chess piece, which, according to the rules of the game, moved forward and backward, but also to the side. So, but the essay definitely concludes that the evaluation of the periphery according to the standard of the center must be considered a historiographical mistake. Regardless of being written in different times and contexts, both essays should be marked as pioneering for bringing forward a historiographical, neglected, or not appropriately evaluated artistic production. In both the approaches, we can see the roots of several present-day historiographical trends and currents, not only in art history, such as global history, migration studies, the history of knowledge, and the post-colonial studies in general. Despite the opposite approaches in many respects, the striking similarities of the essays are even more fascinating, knowing that the author did not know each other. These two contributions can constitute two complementary parts for further development of theoretical approach to the center and periphery questions. In fact, Castelnuovo-Ginzburg's theoretical essay deconstructing the previous historiography in order to present the full complexity of the phenomena with no pretension of taxonomy can be seen as the pars construens, while Karaman's applicable classification, based on the formal expression of artworks, as the pars construens of a discourse on center and periphery paradigm. Thank you.
Fantastic comprehensive analysis of the two extremely important texts on center-periphery between Croatia and Italy. And I would like now to call our last speaker for this session, Professor Vladimir Goss, who recently retired from the University of Vienna, where he is Professor Emeritus. Please, Professor Goss, the floor is yours. Professor Goss will be speaking about Ljubo Karaman and the art of Croatian space.
Honorable Chair, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, given the 15-minute limit, the matter will be discussed in an extremely abbreviated form. 1. Okay. In the classic study, Grand Mill on the l'art moderne, Jacques-André Mauduit, in 1954, he recognized the continuity of prehistoric forms. Thank you. Recognized the continuity of prehistoric forms in the art of the contemporary village and the presence of a symbolic art of signs and schemes as intuitive representations of ideas. He concludes, we had reached the point of large political systems and the beginning of history. From now on, the arts would separate from human beings, having become property of their own classes, whereas the folk art, close to the magic of life, would keep the creative spirit alive. This post-glacial bifurcation of city and village has been masterfully elaborated by Lewis Mumford in his book, The City in History. Creativity is determined by the space in which it occurs and the spirit that generates it. The times of equilibrium between the rural and the urban components should be presumably the golden periods in life of a nation. We should not look for a 50-50, but the urbs and rus should each contribute the maximum required by certain space and time. The one cannot do without the other. Sorry. Croatian space has always been divided into 3 areas: coast, highlands, plain. Within these key zones, there are numerous smaller units, which implies fragmentation, low population density, poor connections, poor flow-through, autarky, and polycentricity. The rural culture of petty noblemen, traditionalist and conservative, is an important positive ingredient of the national character. The countryside flavor of even urban layers of civilization, such as Roman or later urban milieus up to the 20th century, indicates that even the urban populations have maintained a functional and emotional link with the extra-urban areas. The Croatian art and culture lean toward the countryside. This is in harmony with the European West, always bearing in mind that in Croatia, the countryside plays a more prominent role than elsewhere, so that Croatia is a paradigmatic example of Western European space. 3. Ivan Kukuljević, 1816-1889, was the first to consider Croatian art as a single whole in 1859-1860. It was only in 1863 that the Croatian Art History Society published another synthetic study by Ljubo Karaman entitled The Role of Local Milieu in the Art of Croatian Area, republished in 2001 as Problems of Peripheral Art. Karaman, split 1886, died Zagreb 1971, had a long and fruitful career as a scholar and conservationist. By his training in the Vienna Idealist School, he was well prepared for a broad synthetic view of Croatian art. He concluded that within the Croatian space, there emerged a specific art language based on the elements of the provincial, borderland, and peripheral, all in essence, countryside phenomena. Provincialist art, Karaman writes, is an art of countryside developing in the shadow of larger centers. It keeps getting stimuli, artists, and works from one and the same area, receiving them within the framework of its modest economic potentials. The frontier area is a place at the border of two basically different artistic fields, receiving impulses from both of them. All right. Excuse me. Juraj Martinez, split 1848, Donatello, Lobatek. Two areas which are joined in a single monument. And finally, peripheral milieu is an area which at a certain distance from leading centers receive various impulses which are accepted and reworked, creating a specific artistic activity on the native soil. Again, Juraj Martinez, Šibeni Cathedral, really a fantastic blend of early Renaissance, both Florentine, Venetian, late Gothic, anticipations of Cinquecento, and the tradition of basilican building as it was practiced in Dalmatia since pre-Romanesque times. And this sculpture, same thing, from a figura serpentinata of the Gothic all the way to anticipation of Michelangelo's forms, that shows the knowledge of Jacopo della Quercia and the knowledge of Florentine and Tuscan early Renaissance. Wait for a second. All these varieties occurred throughout the Croatian space, and they may be engaged on a level from court to shed. Taken together, they are a unique phenomenon, and all of them may occur on the levels of both elite and folk. This is probably the most important insight Karaman left us. These two levels had also been recognized by Radoslav Katičić in his masterful book, Our Ancient Faith, wherein the great early Slavic linguist deals with the phenomenon of religious duality in Croatia after Christianization, recognizing that both the official faith introduced by the Carolingians and the Croatian native liturgy were legitimate and true faith phenomena, one primarily, but not uniquely, linked to the higher society and urban milieus, the other to the native tradition. Karaman frequently uses words like modest, restrained, even miniature. But this is not a modesty of quality, rather a modesty which is derived from right measure between the nature, this is space, and the work of human hands. The good fit, this is a good fit wherein the natural surroundings and the work of human hands coexist in authentic creative harmony. Some examples of such happy periods, which do not necessarily coincide with political and economic peaks, are. Now I'm going to run through this history of art in Croatia in about 1 minute, so bear with me. First, Vladimir's Carolingian Croatia of late 9th century, with its architecture blending Carolingian motifs, the Western early Christian tradition, early Byzantine tradition of Alt or Isles Basilica, and most likely a Roman inspiration in terms of vaulting, which is extremely rare for that period of time for buildings of this size, and this very unusual system of rounded buttresses, possibly inspired by Roman half columns or engaged columns. A period of extremely high quality sculpture, naturally, both on the level of the port, the Vladimir workshop. This piece from which is Vladimir's name is probably one of the best pieces of interval sculpture in the world. And at the same time, on the populist level, again, the workshop which worked for Vladimir and for the port, but in a very different populist style, with Vladimir's inscription. And as Paul Zikan already noticed about 100 years ago, in Carolingian art, we have the high, real Carolingian, so say humanist, classicist type of art, and we have at the same time something completely different, equivalent of this type of sculpture. Zikan's examples, which I quote here, are both from South Tyrol, they're both 20 kilometers apart, roughly from the same year, 800, and you can yourself notice the difference between, classicizing Carolingian art and some completely different story on a populist level, Second, the Croatia or Pannonia region of Herzegovina in Pannonia in the 13th century, and in Dalmatia, the works such as Master Radovan, the works in the cities of Dalmatia, Communes Dalmatia Dalmatorum. This is the second such period. The third period and complex, of course, is Dubrovnik Renaissance, which is art of Dubrovnik, very high period, lasts from the late 14th century to last 16th century. A real fantastic combination of space, nature, and human intervention. Very imaginative use of architectural detail, wherein, for example, here, Renaissance is in the basement level, ground level, and Gothic is on the upper level, which simply means that these are two very nice, beautiful motifs for the artist, and he's going to use them freely the way he feels fit. And this cooperation between man and nature from 14th century up right to practically present day over life. Croatia rediviva, 4th, 17th century after the liberation from the Turks, particularly in non-Persian Croatia, which was never occupied by the Turks. Another group of monuments, huge actual explosion of creativity, showing contact with the land and the nature, which continues in a long period, which actually starts somewhere in the late 18th century and goes practically to the present day, in which Croatia, going through Art Nouveau, modern period, and so on, creates very nice nature and environment sensitive art in the sense of a very great variety. Like, for example, here, something which you might call historicist buildings, apart from, it doesn't work, early 20th century functionalism, cessation art, art nouveau, modern, and then really continues with this wonderful southern approach to Zagreb, which was created throughout the second half of the 50th century and still being created and uncreated today. To conclude, having or using a much smaller sample than others, Karaman noticed the basic unity of Croatian space in spite of a wide variety of both urban and country manifestations. We have a little problem. I just want to also point out that along this there is this huge complex worldwide class of Croatian manual art, which probably do not need to particularly comment upon. Now, this line of small cathedrals, to quote the poet Boro Pavlović, should be carefully preserved. And we should thank Ljubo Karaman for providing us with some valuable directions on that way. Thank you.
Professor Goss for this wonderful trip throughout Croatian space. Borrowing the words from your time.
Yes, it's very short and abbreviated.
I would like to call, could you stay please? I would like to call our speakers for this morning in order, since everybody was very humble, not to say modest with their time, we have time for very fruitful discussion. So I guess thank you. Yeah, thank you, McQueen. Use this one and I'll use this one. Sorry. We had a wonderful, fantastic number of points of view this morning, illustrating the different historiographical and national, if we can call it national, but we can actually, as we heard this morning, points of view on the Paradigm Center-Periphery. So I would like to call the audience to ask their questions. Just let's start in no particular order, and if we need some order, we'll put it into. So are there any questions? Yes, please.
Hello, everyone. From the Warsaw University. Thank you for all your presentations. I have a question for Alison McQueen. Thank you very much for inspiring lecture. As I perceive your research, it is deeply rooted in an agency of things, and as it is, I believe. Do you use in your study actor network theory, or I know it's and it was 2 years ago very fashionable and maybe overused even now, but do you think it is somehow fruitful for your study or rather redundant for your research?
Yeah, maybe it's easier to listen. Sorry.
Thank you very much for your question. It is actually surprising to me that I didn't choose the word agency. So this was unusual today for me. Perhaps, I'm not sure why. Actor network theory is integral to my work. And I focus a great deal on agency, typically of individuals, and that has been very central to my work on Empress Eugenie and the way in which her agency is manifest through objects, while she doesn't herself have political power. What you have raised about the agency of objects is something that I want to think more about. I have focused more on agency of the patrons rather than the objects. But the idea that you're suggesting to focus more on the agency of the objects is one that I think I need to think more about, because in many instances, particularly related to the extraction that interests me so much, the real actors who did the quarrying and who did the work, we don't know anything about them. In my research on Algeria and other quarrying, I know nothing about the people involved in doing the extraction. I have had no success finding their labor, their wage. I have discovered that they were not prisoners, that they weren't paid laborers. But the way in which their labor is manifest in the object, I thank you for your question, and it's one that I think I should articulate more clearly in the agency of laborers, the workers. We tend to forget about, such as the example of the sculpture by Cordier, emphasizing the artist, whereas the people who extracted the materials that create that, we forget about them. So I thank you. There's a layer there that I need to think more about and articulate more clearly. The agency of laborer, agency of producer is not exclusively the artist, but also the individual who extracts the materials in the natural resources. So that's a part of that network that I think I need to articulate more clearly. Thank you very much. I appreciate the question.
Thank you, Bob. Any other questions or comments? That is what you're still. Yeah. Well, my question is maybe related to that part, since using the materials from the colonies is something that, from the Roman Empire has been put into action, and this perpetuating of a classical tradition, especially Roman Empire, was certainly very dear to the protagonist of your research. So
yes, and actually the Algerian context, many of them were originally ancient Roman quarries.
Mm-hmm.
The one that I showed you the watercolor of was not. It was a new quarry opened by France in the mid-19th century. So there's reworking, reimagining of empire. They could have chosen any of the open quarries, but they chose to open a new quarry. So that's a real exercise of power in a geographical space.
My question to Magdalena Kunińska would be, in your research, you obviously considered a lot of architecture, both sculpture and paintings and architecture, and architecture as a site-specific and very well documented kind was usually very useful, as I understood from your examples that you quoted. But coming from a tradition, well, I come both from Croatian and Italian tradition, and especially Italian tradition divides the history of architecture from the history of art. Have you encountered that kind of division in Eastern European historiographies at all, or they were using this more a broader concept of art and architecture always in all the theoretical works that you looked into?
Formally, there is a kind of theoretical model of style where the architecture is a kind of the first art. So, and that's why architecture is also a borderline and can put points on the map. And for sure in Poland and we have this concept of architecture as a first art and then later. But for example, in Romania, as my colleagues deal with medieval paintings, I think it's more complicated, not only because the Byzantine tradition is also, and from my friend McQueen is dealing with interrelations of Byzantine painting and Western medieval paintings on the nowadays Romania territory. So it differs at some points, but mainly the architecture is a starting point for everybody. Because, for example, the history of paintings, or even creating a kind of schools, national schools of painting. It was also a construct. Of course, in Poland we had a very strange guy who created even Polish names for all Italian artists, like Victor Carpacci. It was Vittore Carpaccio. So yes, also dictionaries were created in the 19th century, but it was the first half of 19th century, and then it was naturalized, I think. And my colleague Magdalena Kunińska is dealing with this old dictionaries and trying to figure out what was the topic of creating these schools of paintings. And of course, the Russia territory, also my colleague Anna Wyszyńska is dealing with the Byzantine style, so also there is painting. So it's everywhere really such a wide scope of research we were trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was really a fashion of the 19th century to give to translate even the names. For example, Ivan Kuica-Sakcinski, the Croatian one of the founding fathers of art history in Croatia was doing the same thing in Croatia. So, and that had also to do with the pan-Slavic movement and the ideas around it. But it's nothing. For example, Karl Weiss, a member of the Viennese Society for Antiquities, was translated into Croatian like Dragutin Weiss. So it was in the 1850s. So it's not strange.
I don't think anybody said it was strange, but it happened. Yes. And I like Karpatsky, I'm sorry. Well, bottom plate and on wall. So, any other comments and questions, please?
I would have a question for Cristiano and Ines. It was really impressed, really rich and beautiful talk. Probably it's too early for this question in this conference, but anyway, could you a bit more elaborate on this practical and theoretical approach and how you, in your own research, consider this question? This division or gap or possibility of combining is also a great challenge, I think, for every researcher, but would you be able to add something?
Okay. We didn't think to combine the two theory, not yet. But we realized that these two approaches were complementary, were really complementary. And this idea of the practical and theoretical approach, I think, derived from the background of these scholars, because on one side we have one of the very first Croatian art historian, Karaman, who tried to establish this category really for future Croatian art historian, and they were really practical because they didn't need scholarship, but they had simply to look at the artworks and perceive the features, and then not really classify because the categories were flexible, but see percentages of peripheral or provincial and so on. This was a really practical approach, probably addressed also to the conservation offices, to this officer that had to travel throughout the territory and look at the artwork. On the other hand, we had this with other scholars, Castelnuovo-Ginzburg, who were the last representatives of a very long art history tradition going back to Vasari. And so their theoretical approach derives from the background at the university. They performed scholarly academic research, so purely theoretical research. They didn't analyze the artworks, so they only quoted artworks, but they didn't analyze artworks in the essay. Yeah, I mean, in terms of features and style and so on. And so they literally deconstruct all the previous scholarship and dissect all the commonplace about central and peripheries, and with no pretension of classification or build some categories. And so this is why we have this differentiation between theory, practical and theoretical approach. I hope to. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Well, I would just like to refer to the last question in the way how we can apply it in our own research. So what we wanted to show actually, we start from these two works. And one thing that actually it's very much noted, these gaps that the historiography and the scholarship of their time couldn't offer, but the things that we have today. From the colonial, post-colonial studies, already mentioned actor network theory, or the recent history of knowledge and the circulation of knowledge, which also in a way asks for a complete abandonment of the center-periphery concepts, also putting the more emphasis on the knowledge rather than actors, also on the actors. So it is something that we are still working on and thinking, not only two of us in our individual studies, in the things that we work together, but also in the part of our research team. And that is why in a way we also wanted to maybe open for the last discussion in a way how this present day theory, historiography approaches can help us to actually upgrade or update Karaman's and maybe Ginzburg and Castelnuovo ideas. So thank you.
Thank you. It was also extremely useful to have Magdalena's and your presentation this morning because you were addressing the issue of repetition, which is also an issue of periodization. So it's the same idea of what is now, what is modern, what is innovative, and what is not, and what is following what, which is obviously a great deal, it's very central to all of our research, basically. So any of you, do you have any ideas whether the Central European art history use this kind of how they reported to the Italian, which is Vasarian periodization, which is not working in Italy itself, but it's not working for any other part of Europe, unless you're talking of the Eastern Adriatic coast, actually. So have you considered that idea of where periodization works and where it doesn't? You probably, I mean, you did a lot, but.
Yes, we tried to. I must say that the project was born because we met in Oxford at the conference and we were speaking about exactly the same things. Igor from Croatia, me, and Ada, and they appeared, and Ada was really interested that there is no periodization in Romanian art, is pre-Ottoman and after Ottoman, and the medieval period is about to the end of the 18th century. So we were trying to deal with the construct of periodization in terms of, this is what Kit Moxie and then Carl Holm did. And to show that Eastern European art does not fix in any place to this periodization, because we can call styles, we can call everything, but it's Western-centered, and I would go for Pasini that it was methodological imperialism, that we were trying to fix ourselves just to prove, especially in Poland, just to prove that we are part of the Western tradition and not Byzantine ones. So yes, we did a lot, and this book finally, I think it's going to be published on 27th, and it's fully open access because it was it was a tenet of the project. So we're trying. I will try in my chapter there. I will try to deal with the theory of time in art history, and then to show one of our surveys influence of Józef Rutkowski. We're trying to fix Polish art history and to add some Polish monuments to the mainly to the handbook of Franz Kugler. So just add, we have the same, so we just add, and we are a part of the Western civilization, yes.
Any other comments or questions at this point, or we are ready for coffee break, I guess?
5 minutes, no more.
Yeah. Everybody heard that I didn't say that. It was Martina.
Okay, so it's a very short 5-minute break for the toilet and coffee. You can take it there on in the bar. And we'll continue with the phone. No, who's next?